President Biden has made blue-collar jobs, and particularly manufacturing jobs, a priority, like his predecessor did. And thus far, he has continued tariffs on imports, though his trade policy, in fairness, is not yet fully formed. Peterson Institute for International Economics President Adam Posen has a piece just that today in Foreign Affairs, challenging some of the assumptions we've been making on trade and on jobs. And we welcome him now back to Bloomberg. Delighted to have you here, Adam. As I say, this came just hot off the presses after midnight here. It's the price of nostalgia, America's self-defeating economic retreat, and it challenges some of the assumptions we're making, may I even call them shibboleths. And let's start with one of them, which is over time we've become more and more open in the United States to free trade, and that's taken away jobs.
Yes, David, thank you for pointing this out and having me on today. The issue is there is this ongoing belief of both left and right in the U.S., of many people, that we've sacrificed American workers in the name of neoliberal trade liberalization. And if that were true, that would be something to worry about, but that's not what's happened. For at least the last 20 years, the American governments, successive Republican and Democratic, have been taking the U.S. out of the world economy in absolute terms and compared to what other rich democracies are doing. Our share of trade is smaller now in the economy than it was 20 years ago. It never recovered after 2008 the way it has in the rest of the world. The countries that have big trade surpluses have seen declines in manufacturing employment, just like in the U.S. This is just an untrue statement. And even more, you can't just buy off the angry white males. It's been proven because we've given them what they've wanted. There's less immigration now than there was in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. There's less takeovers of American companies and new investment from abroad. We've withdrawn from globalization, and it hasn't bought off the populism. It's only made things worse. And finally, David, the biggest thing is this obsession with manufacturing that's only under 12%, sometimes as little as 8% of the total U.S. workforce, is ignoring the fact that we have a services economy of low-income employees, mostly women and people of color, and they deserve just as much security and they deserve just as much improvement in their standard of living as manufacturing workers do. It's like it's criminal justice. When we focus on what's been happening to the privileged white males, then you end up ignoring a lot of the injustice that goes on. And this is what manufacturing obsession does. It's a nostalgia for a time that was unjust.
And this is obviously an economics piece, but there's politics just under the surface of it, I think, for the reason you just described. Because one of the things I learned from this piece, first of all, we've lost some manufacturing jobs, but not nearly as many as we might have thought. We've lost an awful lot more other jobs. And
Right.
A primary difference of those two groups is the manufacturing jobs tend to be white and tend to be male workers, maybe a little more middle-aged, whereas the others tend to be female and non-white.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at the normal average working person in the US, including a lot of white males, to be clear, they suffer a lot of uncertainty. It's not just the gig economy. They have jobs that come and go. And we may not like that, but that's the reality we have. And you would have to do a lot to change that. Whereas in manufacturing, the actual amount of instability and churn is much lower than for most people who are working in lower income groups. And when you look at the demography of it, I mean, we all have the image of Rosie the Riveter. The maximum number of women as a share of manufacturing employees was 30%. It's now down to, I think, low teens. I've got the exact number on the PIIE website. African-American and Hispanic males without high school educations, they should be at least as represented as white people in these jobs because they're a bigger share of the population that has less than high school education. And it turns out, no, they're not as underrepresented as women, but they are underrepresented given the share of lower income and low education people that they have. And so when we obsess over manufacturing, we're chasing this, you use the term shibboleth, which I agree with. We're chasing this thing that never really existed and ignoring the realities. We can do more to bring up all kinds of workers. One other thing, again, Germany, Japan, even China and South Korea, they've seen their manufacturing workforces decline year over year over year. This was a point first made by my colleague Robert Lawrence at Peterson, and we've updated the data and it's still there. And so even if you're running, this isn't about the success of manufacturing. You can manufacture great weapons, great vaccines, great IT, But manufacturing employment isn't something that's going to save large numbers of American workers.
This is a fascinating article. Everybody has to go to Foreign Affairs and read it because we can't cover it on television in the short time that we have. But before we lose you, give us some sense of hope. Where do we head? What's your solution to the problem you've identified?
Well, there's a lot of hope to be had. I mean, the first is that most American workers are much more adaptable and have already gone through much worse than what we're talking about with the China shock or other things that have happened in the recent past. And that adaptability can be supported by things that we can afford to do. Changing the rules for allowing workers to organize better, but also to have more security, making really portable things about pensions and health insurance and benefits so that people who have to change jobs or change locations don't have to give that up. Investing like the Danes and many other Western Europeans do in active labor market policies that help people move between jobs rather than just saying, oh, only if you get displaced by trade do you get this help, which is crazy. But then on the international front, the US has spent decades saying, oh, the rest of the world has to liberalize. That'll reform them. That'll put pressure on them. Well, frankly, the US is the one that now needs to liberalize. We need to make deals, as I know you support, in stronger environmental standards, stronger labor standards. Just as Mexico, just as Japan, just as Southern Europe came up and raised their living standards by opening up to higher standards from abroad, it's time for the US now to open up and be pressured to lift itself up from abroad.
So this is a critical point, I think, in the piece, which is you are not against international trade agreements, quite the contrary, but what are they directed toward? And one of the things we've talked about is we want to compete with the world, but we don't want to compete on some things. We don't want to compete on a worse environment. We don't want to compete on worse labor standards. So there is a rule, and taxation, corporate taxation, very much in the news right now with the OECD working on this.
You're absolutely right. And this is the idea, David, and this is where the US should be. We're a high wage, high capital, high skill economy, and we have the capacity to treat our workers well. And so we should be competing on higher standards, and we should not be trying to just protect yesterday's industries, or rather yesterday's employment, today's industries. And you mentioned corporate taxes, which I advocate some amount of international harmonization and minimum in the piece, in the Foreign Affairs article. And kudos to Secretary Yellen and the Biden administration for taking this on. This is a perfect example. The US has been doing harm to its workers by allowing corporations to shift their profits abroad to low tax jurisdictions and not taking their share. But the only way that the US can get that money is by admitting that we have to coordinate with the other major economies and make it so that the small tax havens can't get away with this. Instead, the US, chasing nostalgia, had ignored the fact that we need global coordination to deal with this. So international corporate taxation, like international environmental standards, and like potentially some work on digital agreements, these are all things where the US can do better by its workers by opening up more and agreeing with others.
And as I say, a terrific piece. I want to remind everybody again, The Price of Nostalgia in Foreign Affairs just came out today. Thanks so much to Adam Posen. He's president of the Peterson Institute.